Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so, how politics should appear in our preaching this week. And this comes at an extremely relevant time where many questions have been asked about whether the church should get involved in politics, and there are many opinions on that abounding. My name is Jenny Mills, and I am Secretary for Education and Learning for the United Reformed Church. Previous to that, I was a minister in pastorate in Newport Pagnell and in Wolverton near Milton Keynes. I'm also on the board of directors of an alternative education provider in Milton Keynes. And for me, the focus in my ministry has been community, realising potential, inclusivity and welcome. My role in the United Reformed Church involves me in all areas of learning, and we have a particular focus on discipleship and lifelong learning within the United Reformed Church. So I deal with those from ministers to lay preachers and anyone on their discipleship journey. Each week I'm going to be joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. Today I am extremely delighted to introduce the Reverend Barrett. Al is the rector of Hodge Church in East Birmingham, a partnership between the Church of England and the United Reformed Church. He's also a co-convener for the locally rooted Common Ground community. His recent book, Being Interrupted, Reimaging the Church's Mission from the Outside In, was written with Ruth Harley and calls the church to open the door to a creative disruption of the status quo. Al, welcome. It's lovely to see you.
Thanks, Jenny. Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So, politics in the pulpit. I wonder if we could just initially explore what that means to you. So if you tell us a little bit about yourself and your setting and how you see yourself as a pulpit politician.
Okay, to be honest, I don't think I've ever used that phrase before, but it's an interesting question. So I'm the Anglican minister in Hodge Hill, which is on the eastern edge of the city of Birmingham, just under the M6 motorway as it continues southwards from Spaghetti Junction on the concrete pillars still. So many people will have driven over us or overlooked us on the way past. Hodge Hill's a fascinating area. I've been vicar here for about 12 years now. It's a parish of about 20,000 people. There's a real mix of class and ethnicity. We have a large Muslim community locally, and also a large council estate that was built in the 60s, which is where I call home, the Firs and Bromford.
Okay.
So my journey here for the last 12 years has been very much one of seeking to embed myself in the local community as a neighbour, as a friend, as someone who is journeying alongside neighbours on a journey of building community locally. And the church has very much found itself kind of drawn into that journey as guest, as much, if not more, than host. And so I guess when we gather together as church on a Sunday morning, what we've sought to do over the time that I've been here is draw in stories and voices from our neighbourhood into our worship and shape our worship. So when I get behind the lectern, we're not as grand as having a pulpit with steps to climb up. We seek to have a conversation that's about making connections between the stories of our neighbourhood, the stories of our faith tradition, but also locating ourselves within the wider world, and obviously within the kind of neighbourhood that I'm in, that I would describe as in some ways being pushed to the edges of our society and of our economics and our culture. Actually, questions of marginalisation, questions of injustice, kind of become life for us.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you about, in your context. So you've already touched on some of those issues that are relevant to where you find yourself. and the idea of those stories being reflected through the lives of the people you engage with, but also through the worship in the congregation and the church. Thank you so much for that. Each week, our JPIT colleagues give us a little roundup of their expertise and what they think we ought to be keeping an eye on in the world this week. So I'd just like to share some of those, and perhaps we can look at how they engage with your context. We have the Nationality and Borders Bill that's been voted through by MPs and will now pass into law. And at the same time, the government are facing legal challenges on their plans to send refugees to Rwanda, and lost a legal challenge to their policy to push back small boats in the Channel. There have been multiple accounts of sexism and misogyny reported from Westminster, with female MPs sharing what it feels to work in that environment. In Ukraine, Russia are using gas as a blackmail tool against other European countries. The UN Secretary General visited Ukraine this week, and NATO are now saying the war could last years. This week, the Trussell Trust have reported that they gave away 2.1 million food parcels between 2021 and 22, the first time that they have given over 2 million parcels outside of the pandemic, and they're calling on the government to increase benefit payments in order to support families who are becoming dependent on emergency supplies. And then there are local elections in Scotland, Wales, and many parts of England on Thursday. So the some of the cost of living issues, and I mean particularly the Trussell Trust one is absolutely heartbreaking, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. And certainly in our community here, we've been really conscious of food poverty for some years. It's not a new issue for us, but certainly, I mean, the increases in gas bills, for example, means that we have people coming into our drop-in every Tuesday, and they're having to make really hard decisions about whether they use any power to heat their homes in the cold weather, or whether they're able to afford food. So yeah, I mean, that's desperate.
And it feels that it's about we're doing lots of sticking plasters, aren't we, at the moment, rather than actually hitting the root cause of some of these things. So that whole let's stop pulling people out the river and ask why they're falling in further up. But I think that's massive, isn't it? So we're in the church season of Easter, and obviously we've come together to also talk about some of the texts that we're going to be encountering on the 8th of May. As in this church season, resurrection abounds. But I don't know about you, it feels to me that for a number of reasons, many of us are struggling to go beyond the Good Friday, Holy Saturday emotions, and there's a lot of pain and struggle and anxiety and political instability, which makes us feel quite anxious, and people are feeling quite desperate. And obviously the war in Ukraine and the conflicts in other parts of the world are affecting all of this. Personally, life has thrown some curveballs at me, and I feel that for me at the moment, resurrection is perhaps about hope and about knowing that there will be new life rather than being able to live within that. Can you identify with any of that at all?
Oh, absolutely. And I think for me, I've been particularly aware of that sense of kind of resurrection deferred for the last couple of years. I think kind of having tried to celebrate 2 Easters during COVID and lockdowns, and what that's meant has really forced us to think afresh about what Easter means in practice. And absolutely, I'm with you that Holy Saturday experience of being hit by the trauma of death and grief and loss, and in a sense dwelling in that space of not knowing what comes next, even though kind of in our heads we've done Easter 20, 30, 40, 50 times in our lives already. Actually, we find ourselves in that space, and that space feels like it's lengthening at the moment. And actually, I think we need to be really attentive to what that space feels like, what the dynamics of that space are. In my work over the last few years, and particularly the book that I co-wrote with Ruth Harley, we found some real insight in the work of trauma theologians, particularly an American theologian called Shelley Rambo, who talks about sensing life in the midst of ongoing trauma. And she uses the word sensing as a word that's kind of quite deliberately more fuzzy, less tangible, less graspable than our narratives of resurrection that are often far more triumphant and kind of decisive. She talks about that sense of when our senses are dulled for whatever reason, actually kind of just feeling ahead and trying to kind of touch things that may be sources of hope for us, and that's what a lot of life feels like, I think, for all of us at the moment, and certainly personally, and certainly in our community, there's a lot of that sense around.
May I just apologise for my camera? I don't quite know what's going on with it at the moment, but it's just really not being very happy. So I do apologise for that. Thank you for that, and I think it's really helpful. It's helpful to think about the things in that context. I wonder, we've come to the texts for the 8th of May, and I wondered where you wanted to start, and how you want us to look at those, and what particularly spoke to you, what themes spoke to you, just how the context of where those readings come from and how they relate to today. So lead me on and tell me where you want us to go.
So yeah, I think the readings take me on a bit of a journey, but I think I want to start with a combination of the John 10 passage and Psalm 23, and this image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, which obviously is so familiar to us and so well known. But digging into Psalm 23 particularly, I was struck by one of the commentaries I was reading. Points to the green pastures and the still waters, and the paths of righteousness, or even the right paths, as one translation puts it, as being about the basic necessities of life. I think sometimes we read Psalm 23 and we have this beautiful sort of English pastoral kind of ideal summer holiday day out, but actually there's something in this about the basic necessities of life. This is about food and drink for the sheep. Green pastures and still waters are what a sheep needs to be able to get the stuff that it needs to live from day to day. And the right paths, the commentary suggested, is talking about primarily about safety from danger. So here we have a really familiar text, but in the context, as you said earlier, particularly of the news this week about new laws in this country that kind of entrench our policies to those who have travelled far from their homes because they've been displaced by war and climate change and famine and an unjust distribution of resources in our world. People who have travelled the most dangerous journeys, people who have lost loved ones along the way, seeking just the basics of life, food and drink and shelter and safety. And I kind of, when I realised that connection, I heard Psalm 23 afresh.
No, that's really helpful, because I think it's one that we're so familiar with and is used in weddings and funerals, and we use it as kind of a comfort, but actually that idea that it's going to the heart of who we are as ordinary people. And I think when you talk about the laws as well, we've got these concerns in the last few days about the citizenship can be removed, that we're moving closer to NHS privatisation, and I think those things that some of us who perhaps are more fortunate are going to be able to access those things still, but those on the edges are going to be excluded in so many ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, as with all biblical texts, it makes so much difference to how you hear it depending on where you're located, and what your experience of life is. And I think one of the things that the biblical texts invite us to do is enter into the shoes and the experiences of our neighbours who have very, very different life experiences to us. So that actually, Psalm 23 is not necessarily just a comfort of a lovely, peaceful day out. Actually, Psalm 23 through the eyes and in the shoes of someone who has lived life in danger and without the basics actually is, like you were saying at the beginning, Jenny, a message of hope.
Yeah. And so onto the John 10. I mean, it feels a bit like Jesus is not going to win in this, is he? Whatever he says, it's going to be wrong. And when we look at the political climate and the comments from the Archbishop of Canterbury and how they've been received, do we hear? How would you hear this text?
So I think the question at the heart of it, for me, was the question: are you the Messiah? And we're not too far past the Palm Sunday story of the crowds of Jerusalem excitedly welcoming this man riding a donkey into the city, and all the expectations that go with that. And again, holding the John 10 passage and Psalm 23 together, Walter Brueggemann, commenting on Psalm 23, reminds us that the Lord is my shepherd is an immensely political statement, because what it's saying is that God is our shepherd leader and no one else. That Jesus is the Messiah, and a very particular, strange kind of Messiah, and no one else. And I think both of these passages invite us to examine our own desires and needs for leadership, for people to look to for authority, and ask immensely critical questions of the kind of human leaders that we have over us in our country, in our world, even as local elections happen this week in our local areas as well. And to start from the position that the only leader we owe allegiance to ultimately is God, and that God is the kind of leader that comes as shepherd, but also that comes as a Messiah who is crucified, that comes as a person that opens themselves utterly up to vulnerability in solidarity with those at the edges. That radically critiques our expectations of what leadership looks like in our world.
Yeah. And in this text, I picked up some sort of the bits about liberation without having to earn it. Do you know what I mean? My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. It's not about earning that or doing anything to have that, to be worthy of that love, and that total acceptance, in contrast to the power of those who are quizzing Jesus. I just wondered if you wanted to, if we could think about, in the New Revised Standard Version, it says Jesus is rejected by the Jews, and it isn't all of the Jews, is it? It's those in power, and I wonder if we can kind of look at that alongside the idea that if Jesus came today, how would he be received, saying words like this?
Sure, and I think, power is the key word here, isn't it? Because these are the Jewish leaders, these are the religious authorities who are, in a sense, kind of trying to trip Jesus up, and we must assume because they feel threatened. They can see in Jesus a different way of exercising power and authority to the way that is theirs, and they can see that it's clearly attractive. And I think, in our world, particularly in the world of kind of formal politics, if you like, it can be very easy to kind of just play the same game as whoever we see ourselves in opposition to. but actually the Jesus invitation is to an utterly different way of exercising power. And I think in a minute when we come on to the Acts reading, we can probably tease that out a bit further. But I think
there if you want to. Take us there. That's fine. Absolutely. We'll follow where you lead.
So I think we're used to a sense of kind of power as controlling territory, power as competition, kind of power as or one-upmanship against whoever we're trying to sort of beat down, even in the cause of justice and whatever, you know, and I think. And the title of the JPIC conference this year is a really helpful one here. From the ground up is what we're talking about. The season of resurrection is a season quite literally of uprising, of raising up from the ground, not of kind of filling the positions of hierarchical power and sort of taking control of the levers of power, if you like. And in this difficult reading from Acts chapter 9, the raising of Tabitha or Dorcas, you know, we see in a sense the writer of Acts telling us something about the ripple effects of the resurrection of Jesus. You know, Jesus's resurrection is the thing that changes everything. But in the stories of Acts, we see how that works itself out in practice. And in this incredible story of the resurrection of a woman of faith, a female disciple, a leader within the community, you know, we see her literally brought back to life, but raised up. I think I need to acknowledge that I find this story difficult and uncomfortable. I think it's inspiring in many ways because here we have a named female leader within the community. That's really good news. I find it uncomfortable because the way Tabitha or Dorcas exercises her leadership in many ways is in very stereotypical female ways. She makes clothes, she gives in charity to people, and in this story she doesn't have a voice at all. She's someone who is done to. She's a victim of death, and then she's done to by a male disciple. Nevertheless, it feels like there's something really important here. And I guess it goes back to what we were saying earlier about Holy Saturday, Jenny, that, you know, it's so easy in the story of Jesus' resurrection, but equally in the story of Tabitha or Dorcas's resurrection, to skip over the tragedy of death. You know, it's done in a verse in Acts chapter 9. But actually we need to stay in that space first and just enter into that experience of loss. Tabitha was a greatly loved, greatly respected leader in the community, and she died. We're well acquainted with that kind of experience of losing people who are at the heart of our communities, and COVID particularly has kind of sharpened that sense of loss. So let's stay for a moment with that tragedy and that sense that our communities are fragile. Let's inhabit that space of mourning alongside those who loved Tabitha.
And in that reading too, I think I picked up, you know, that sense, that amazing sense of community, and when we are in the dark times, when things are really tough, it is that community that sustains us. It is that sense of belonging, and as you talk about the death. You know, there are deaths in so many ways in each of our lives all the time, but that sense of being supported through a community is huge, and that really comes across in this reading, doesn't it?
No, absolutely. And I think one of our dangers as Christians, or one of our temptations as Christians, can so often be to try and explain tragedy away, or jump to the happy ending,
to the good bits,
to the good bits, you know. And you know, I can't stand the everything happens for a reason kind of response to things, because, you know, death and tragedy is senseless. There's not reason in it. It's not God's will. God does not want a world where people are devastated by grief.
No.
And so we need to stay in that moment. But like you say, actually what community can do is hold us in that space. We can hold on to one another in our grief and grieve together and find solidarity in that. And just as, the story of the women who stayed watching Jesus die at the cross, who were the women who followed his body to the tomb, who were the women who returned to the tomb to do what needed to be done. It's that staying together, that solidarity, that remaining in community of love, that can be the dark ground within which resurrection can begin to spring up, which is not the same as saying death, had to be, that everything happens for a reason, but it is saying that God can bring life out of the most desperate of tragedies.
Yeah, I think what I picked up in this one as well was this the difference in style of writing. This is almost, the sort of story you have when you're talking over the fence to somebody. Do you know what I mean? It's got such a grounded nature to it, hasn't it? The actual writing in the text, as opposed to the John reading, which is a lot harder. Just the metaphors and images are just so much harder to kind of understand, aren't there? And I think that we've already looked at the Psalm as well. Those different styles of writing kind of inspire and engage us. How do you see yourself kind of using these texts in worship with the themes that we've sort of identified?
That is a really interesting question. I mean, I guess the John and the Psalm 23, the images there, as we said, are so familiar, and kind of, there are obvious hymns that we can go to straight away. There are images that can kind of permeate our liturgy in some ways. With the Acts reading, it's harder to see how some of that works out liturgically, and I speak as quite a liturgical Anglican that likes having poetic structure to worship. But as you say, I mean, there's something very matter of fact about this reading, and I guess part of the question might be simply just how it's read. I can think of different readers within our congregation who would probably approach it in quite different ways. And this is a story, so let's tell it as a story, and let's pause in those moments of tragedy. Let's feel the emotions that come out of it, and let's share the amazement of those present at resurrection here, and the strangeness and the shock of that. So I guess some of it's just about how we tell the story, I think.
No, that's really helpful. And I think I love that this is story, and we sometimes try to make things so complex, as opposed to just letting hear the story and let it sit with us and see where it resonates with us. So I think that's really huge. In terms of the themes, I think we've got the shepherd theme, haven't we, and the kind of everyday life. Is there anything else you wanted to pull out of any of those texts before we kind of wrap this up? Is there anything that I've missed that you're really burning to share with me? So
my journey with these texts started with the familiar and ended with or ends with the strangest, I think. And actually I want to end with the Revelation, because there's some stuff in there. Revelation has never naturally been a book that I have been drawn to over the years. I find much of it really hard. But there's some stuff in there that just feels absolutely unavoidable for us here. And I think I want to make a link from the Acts into the Revelation, because the Greek word for resurrection, the Greek word for arise that Peter says to Tabitha Dorcas, is a word that means uprising or upstanding. And I'm really struck by this image in Revelation 7 of a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing.
Yeah.
And they stand and they cry out and they sing. And these, we're told, are people who have come through suffering,
Yeah.
who have come through a great ordeal.
Yeah.
And, however Revelation casts that great ordeal and that suffering, I think I want to apply that image to the world that we live in now, as a vision of hope, but also as a vision of potential solidarity in the present. One of the things that you didn't mention in terms of things that have happened this week, another bill that has just passed through the House of Commons is the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill.
Yes.
Which amongst other things gives police power to restrict protests they deem too noisy.
Yes.
I want to say that Revelation 7 has something to say to the banning of noisy protests. Actually, we're talking about a multitude coming together to stand together, to cry out together, to sing together. We know that behind some of the motivations behind that bill are banning the activities of Extinction Rebellion, banning the kind of mass protests of mass solidarity of Black Lives Matter, are banning other potential opportunities in the next few years for us to come together across difference, in solidarity with those who are suffering most, with those who are being pushed to the margins most, and say the world that we're in is not the world that should be, and is not the world that will be. And I think this image in Revelation should be an image that fires us to protest, to stand together, but also I think to ask questions about what our church worship looks like from week to week. Because actually, if our church worship is monochrome, where difference and diversity is not necessarily embodied in our gatherings, where solidarity across difference is not at the heart of it, then I think the critique of God in Amos chapter 5, hating and despising our festivals and not wanting to listen to our songs, kind of applies to us, and we need to hear that critique. And we need to go out and look for places in our world where people are standing together and crying out together and singing together across difference, and say, actually, that is where the kingdom of God is to be found and to be seen and heard.
Yeah. So I'm totally with you on this. The idea of the inclusivity. It's being inclusive. It's being community, and I feel at times we've lost the how subversive the gospel is. We've lost that essence of the radical nature of the gospel. So thank you so much for that, and for bringing us together with the revelation. Thank you so much for coming to share your. I think we could probably carry on for a number of longer, but we do have to end now. So thank you so much for coming and sharing, and you now have that new title, politician in the pulpit, or pulpit politician. But thank you ever so much, Al, for sharing with us today.
Thanks.
To those who are listening to or watching this, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to the podcasts, and share this episode with your friends. We know that the listeners of this podcast are passionate and knowledgeable, and we'd love to build a community of learning and encouragement around the podcast. So before each episode, we're asking for your questions. If you want to join us on Twitter at pulpit _ politics, or using the hashtag politics in the pulpit, or on Facebook, which you can join through the Joint Public Issues Team Facebook page and the website jointpublicissues.org.uk. I have a question that I'd like to just kind of throw out there lastly, and it kind of ties in with Al saying Revelation is not a book that he would have spent spent a lot of time with because it is complex. Someone once said to me that the book of Revelation has been compared to a first century private eye. Do we miss the nuances because we are not in there? And how politically subversive do we actually, and I think you've already highlighted that, think that the book of Revelation is and can be, particularly to inspire us nowadays? Let us know your thoughts on Twitter or Facebook. Finally, Al, you've mentioned that you are going to be at a keynote speaker at the conference from the ground up, unearthing hope and seeking justice, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to offer us in that. And thank you for mentioning that. And as I said, I think we could have said more, but we do have to leave it here. Before we end, though, the tickets for the conference are available now. It will be held on site in Oasis Waterloo and online. So please go to jointpublicissues.org.uk/conference and you will be able to see and hear Al again. Thank you so much for your input, your insight, your learning, and the challenges you've given us. Would you just like to have a quick comment before we end with a blessing?
Thanks, Jenny. It's been a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm looking forward to the conversations at the conference as well.
Thank you so much. So may we be anointed with God's Spirit as we bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.